Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's drift back in time to a period that changed the world. Don't worry, there won't be loud noises here, just quiet, thoughtful facts about World War II, told slowly and gently to help you relax and ease into sleep. A sudden move at dawn. It was the 1st of September, 1939. The morning light over Europe was pale and cool, and the world, though tense, still turned in rhythm. But before most people had risen from their beds, the stillness of that day began to break. German forces, under Adolf Hitler's command, had crossed into Poland with overwhelming force. It was not a slow, creeping advance. It was fast, brutal, and loud. This tactic was called Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It combined tanks, planes, and rapid infantry in a seamless wave of destruction. Villages were overrun, roads were flooded with fleeing civilians, and the sound of boots on pavement began to echo in places that had known peace for decades. Within hours, Polish defences were crumbling. The German war machine moved efficiently, with calculated cruelty. And while Poland fought valiantly, it was clear that this was a new kind of war. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. But their response was quiet, measured. There were no immediate battles on the Western Front, no great clash of armies. And so, the world found itself not with a bang, but with a breathless, frozen moment. The Second World War had begun, and just like that, the stillness broke. Quiet warnings. Ignored. Wars rarely begin in a single moment. They build. Quietly, slowly, often in the shadows of comfort. The 1930s had been filled with warnings. Germany, after its defeat in the First World War, simmered with resentment and hunger. Under Adolf Hitler's rule, it began to rise again, faster than anyone had expected. In 1936, German troops entered the Rhineland, a region they were forbidden to militarize. The world watched, but no one intervened. In 1938, Austria was annexed in what was called the Anschluss. Hitler was greeted by cheering crowds. No shots were fired. Then came Czechoslovakia, first the Sudetenland, then the rest. Once again, no real resistance from the world. Each step emboldened Hitler. Each silence taught him the world would look away. There were voices of caution. Some leaders warned what might come next, but many chose hope over preparation, diplomacy over confrontation. By the time Poland was invaded, the warnings had already faded into regret. The storm had been gathering for years, and now it had arrived. Sometimes the storm is already forming, even when the skies are still. Poland stands alone. When the German invasion began, Poland was surrounded, caught between two giants. To the west, Germany. To the east, the looming presence of the Soviet Union. Polish soldiers fought bravely, on horseback against tanks, with pride against the tide. They defended cities, bridges, and fields, many fighting without full equipment or even uniforms. Families fled into forests, while children watched the sky for bombers. Within days, the capital, Warsaw, was under siege. Then, on September 17th, the Soviet Union entered Poland from the east, sealing its fate. Poland's allies, Britain and France, had declared war, but no help would come in time. The Polish government fled, and yet resistance never truly ended. An underground army formed. Secret schools, hidden radios, and brave souls refused to surrender their country entirely. Poland stood alone, but it never stood still. In the darkness, courage flickers like a candle in the wind. The phony war after Poland fell, the war entered a strange, uneasy silence. Though Britain and France were officially at war with Germany, there was little action on the Western Front. This period became known as the Phony War. It lasted from late 1939 into the spring of 1940. Soldiers waited in trenches and forts. Commanders made plans they weren't yet ready to use. Civilians braced for bombings that hadn't come. In cities across Europe, people tried to hold on to normal life. Shops stayed open. Trains still ran. The sky was watched carefully, but it remained mostly empty. It was a time of uncertainty, an anxious calm. Some hoped war could still be avoided. Others feared the worst was only paused. And then, in May 1940, Germany struck again. Sometimes, the quiet between breaths is the heaviest sound of all. Night falls on Warsaw. The Siege of Warsaw began on September 8, 1939. For 3 weeks, the city held out. Day and night, bombs rained down, streets became rubble, hospitals overflowed. And yet, the people of Warsaw stood their ground. Families sheltered in basements, sharing food and silence. Volunteers dug trenches. Children carried water through firelit streets. On September 27th, Warsaw surrendered. The city had fallen, but not quietly. And even after the flames dimmed and the smoke cleared, the spirit of Warsaw remained. In resistance groups, in whispered songs, in the refusal to forget, even in the deepest night, the soul of a city holds on. The fall of autumn leaves. As the world slipped into war, the seasons carried on. Leaves turned gold, then brown. The air grew cool. Autumn came, as it always had. But everything else was changing. In homes across Europe, suitcases were packed. Men were called to service. Newspapers filled with grim headlines. Young boys traded school books for rifles. And yet, the trees still stood, shedding leaves in silence. A soft, beautiful reminder of what the world had once been, and might someday be again. War can arrive gently, like falling leaves, but it does not go as softly. A war of old and new. World War II began with a strange mix of eras. Horse-drawn carts rolled beside tanks. Soldiers sent messages by radio and by handwritten note. In Poland, cavalry still charged into battle. In Germany, aircraft carried bombs across borders in hours. It was a war between the modern and the remembered. And as the months passed, the old ways would fall away, slowly, then all at once. Trench warfare, once dominant, gave way to mobility. Communications sped up, tactics changed, and the war became something the world had never seen before. History turns slowly, even in the shadow of war. Children on the move. In Britain, a plan was quietly set in motion. Operation Pied Piper. It began in September 1939. The goal was simple: protect the children. Over 1.5 million children were evacuated from cities to the countryside. They left with gas masks, sandwiches, and paper name tags pinned to their coats. Trains filled with quiet faces, unsure of where they were going, or when they'd return. Some found comfort, others found loneliness. For many, it was the first moment they understood that war was not just a thing adults talked about. It was real, and it had already taken something from them. Sometimes the gentlest heroes are the smallest feet walking into the unknown. The world watches. Across oceans and continents, the world looked on. In Canada, Australia, South Africa, India, and beyond, people watched as Poland fell and Europe shifted. Some sent troops, others sent aid, and some just waited. In the United States, many believed the war was far away, another nation's problem, but others feared it would not stay distant for long. Radio reports came in every evening. Newspapers sold out in hours. The world felt smaller than ever, and soon that feeling would prove true. A whisper at the edge of the world can still reach every heart. Before the flood. In the last months of 1939, the world stood on a fragile ledge. The war had begun, but the full wave had not yet crashed. In Britain and France, people lived in a strange limbo. Soldiers trained. Children were evacuated. Air raid shelters were dug in back gardens. And still, each evening, families sat for dinner. Listened to the radio. Watched the sky. It was peace, but only barely. The air was full of waiting. And as the year turned, the flood arrived. And so, under a blanket of stars, the world turned, unknowingly, toward fire. The fall of Denmark and Norway. In the early hours of April 9th, 1940, Denmark and Norway woke to a new reality. German forces had launched Operation Weserübung, a lightning-fast invasion of both countries. It was a move designed to secure resources, control shipping lanes, and gain strategic access to the Atlantic. Denmark, small and flat, understood the weight of what was coming. Rather than let Copenhagen burn, the Danish government chose to surrender, almost immediately. There were no major battles, just quiet, heavy acceptance, and the lowering of flags. Norway resisted. German paratroopers fell from the sky. Ships landed at ports. The Norwegians, with help from British and French forces, fought in the fjords and mountains. It was cold, rugged, brave. But by June, Norway too was under German control. The invasions were swift, clean on paper, but each left scars beneath the surface. And so, even the snow-covered silence was stirred. The Maginot Line stands still. France had not forgotten the horrors of World War I. And so, in the years that followed, it built a wall, long, heavy, deeply fortified. The Maginot Line. It was a marvel of engineering. Tunnels ran beneath it. Cannons peeked from reinforced bunkers. Men waited, confident that if war ever came again, France would be ready. But war, as it often does, refused to follow the rules. In May 1940, when German forces attacked, they didn't go through the Maginot Line. They went around it, through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, a region believed to be too dense, too rugged for tanks. But the tanks came anyway. France was outflanked. The wall stood, intact, unmoved, and irrelevant. The soldiers inside the bunkers listened as the war passed them by. Sometimes, strength lies in flexibility, and sometimes walls are only strong if they are in the right place. But the enemy never knocked on that door. The Blitzkrieg rolls on. With stunning speed, Germany pushed west. Their strategy was brutal and efficient. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Planes bombed from above. Tanks rolled through roads and fields. Radio communication made it all feel like a single moving body. Belgium fell, then the Netherlands, and in just weeks, the Germans were in northern France. This was not the long, static trench warfare of the last World War. This was motion, disruption, fear. Enemy lines were broken before commanders could react. Civilians fled. Soldiers were surrounded. Chaos reigned. It was breathtaking, if terrifying. The German advance seemed unstoppable. France, once confident, now reeled. A storm that didn't crawl. It flew. Paris falls, without a fight. Paris, the heart of France, had been through revolutions, empires, and occupation before, but this time felt different. As German forces neared the city in June 1940, the French government made a painful decision to declare Paris an open city, no defense, no destruction. They hoped to save it from the fate of Warsaw. They chose surrender over ruin. When the Germans marched in, there was no gunfire, no crumbling buildings, just quiet footsteps on cobblestone streets, and the raising of swastika flags over once proud landmarks. The Eiffel Tower stood tall, as always, but now under shadow. Cafes went silent, radios changed stations, lives adjusted in slow, stunned silence. It was not just a military loss, it was a psychological one, and the silence in Paris spoke louder than any battle. Not all losses come with noise, some arrive with footsteps. The evacuation of Dunkirk. In late May 1940, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops were trapped in Dunkirk, France, pressed against the sea by advancing German forces. They were surrounded. The beach was flat, exposed, and hopeless. But then came the call, Operation Dynamo. Warships, ferries, fishing boats, Even pleasure yachts crossed the English Channel. Men rowed, civilians volunteered. They didn't know if they'd return. Under constant bombardment, over 330,000 soldiers were rescued. One by one, boat by boat. Dunkirk was not a victory, but it was not a defeat. It was survival, unity, a quiet defiance in the face of collapse. And the soldiers who lived to fight another day would remember the sea forever. Sometimes, retreat is a kind of miracle. A divided France. After the fall, France was torn in two. The north was occupied by Nazi Germany. The south became Vichy France, a puppet government that claimed independence but bent to Nazi rule. Marshal Pétain led this strange, uneasy state. It cooperated with German demands. It enforced anti-Jewish laws. It tried to balance pride and survival, but lost both. Yet beneath the quiet surface, others moved. The French resistance, small at first, then growing, planted seeds of rebellion. They hid radios, printed forbidden papers, passed messages in loaves of bread, sabotaged rail lines, smuggled people across borders. It was a war within a war. And though the Vichy regime flew one flag, the soul of France flew another. While the flag changed, the soul of France did not. Britain stands alone. With France fallen, Britain was alone. Across the English Channel, the German war machine loomed. Plans were drawn for an invasion, Operation Sea Lion. But first, the skies would need to be won. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, newly appointed, addressed his people. His words were calm, unwavering. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender. The British built shelters, blacked out their windows. They prepared not for victory, but survival. Children were sent to the countryside. Men joined the Home Guard. Women learned to fight fires, drive ambulances, grow food. The world held its breath. And Britain stood. The island may have seemed small, but its courage filled the skies. The Battle of Britain begins. In the summer of 1940, the sky over Britain changed. German bombers came in waves, day and night. Fighter planes tangled in the clouds. Sirens wailed. London and dozens of cities were bombed again and again. This was the Battle of Britain, and it was the first major battle fought entirely in the air. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, held firm. Using radar, quick response and grit, they pushed back. Civilians took shelter in basements, subways, even under staircases. Fire brigades raced through flame-lit nights, and in October, Germany gave up its invasion plans. The skies quieted, briefly. The battle was in the air, but its weight was in every heart below. Voices over the airwaves. As France fell and much of Europe darkened, a voice rose above it all. It was Charles de Gaulle, a French general in exile, speaking from London. His voice crackled through radios. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. It was a whisper of hope, a spark in the gloom. Across Europe, in homes with blackout curtains and smuggled radios, people listened. Even when they were told not to. The radio became more than a device. It was resistance. It was memory. It was connection. Words have power, especially when truth is rare. Even in silence, hope finds a voice. The underground begins. As Germany's grip tightened on Europe, people disappeared from view. Not in defeat, but in defiance. Teachers, bakers, students, mothers became something else. Messengers, saboteurs, saviors. This was the underground. They forged passports in candlelight, passed secrets on scraps of paper, smuggled children through forests, exploded rail lines at night, then blended into the crowd by morning. They wore no uniform. Their weapon was silence. Their shield was the ordinary. But their courage shaped the course of history. A whisper beneath the floorboards can still shake a throne. Operation Barbarossa begins. On a quiet morning in June 1941, as the sun rose gently over the forests and fields of Eastern Europe, it began. Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, was the largest military operation in history. 3 million German soldiers crossed the border, accompanied by tanks, artillery, supply trucks, and aircraft. They pushed forward in columns that seemed to stretch endlessly. The goal was swift domination. The plan was bold, and the consequences would be unimaginable. Soviet forces, caught off guard, fell back in chaos. Planes were destroyed on the ground. Towns and villages were consumed in dust and fire. Millions were captured. But the Soviet Union was vast, and with every mile gained, the German advance became thinner, more vulnerable. The land was wide, the weather unpredictable, the people resilient. What began as a confident march became a grueling struggle. The first strike had been deadly, but it had awakened a sleeping giant. Some battles begin in fire, but end in frost. The Siege of Leningrad. In the north, beside a wide lake and under ancient skies, the city of Leningrad stood surrounded. The siege began in September 1941. It would last 900 days. Cut off from food, fuel, and the outside world, the people endured what few ever could. Winters were brutal, water pipes froze, heating failed. Bread rations shrank to mere crumbs. Some survived on wallpaper paste or sawdust. Some didn't survive at all. But the city never surrendered. Artists continued to paint. Writers kept writing. An orchestra, starved and ragged, performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony as shells fell outside. It wasn't just about resisting an army. It was about resisting despair. And when the siege finally lifted in 1944, Leningrad was broken, but unbeaten. Even under siege, the human spirit finds music. The scorched earth. As the Red Army fell back before the German advance, they left only emptiness behind. Fields were set on fire. Bridges were destroyed. Factories were dismantled and moved east, piece by piece. This was the scorched earth policy, a decision made not out of cruelty, but necessity. If the enemy could not be stopped, they would be starved. Entire villages became ash. Railroads twisted in heat. Barns were reduced to smouldering skeletons of wood. It was a sacrifice, not of land, but of comfort and memory, of livelihoods and homes. The flames lit up the night. But behind them, far in the east, a different kind of fire began to grow. The will to survive, the will to return. Sometimes what we destroy shows what we refuse to give. The Red Army rebuilds. In the early days of the invasion, the Soviet military was broken. Over 1 million soldiers were lost. Tanks were destroyed. Planes littered the fields. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. It rebuilt. Factories were relocated east of the Ural Mountains, far beyond the reach of German bombers. There, day and night, machines roared, producing tanks, rifles, artillery, and uniforms. Women worked assembly lines. Children gathered scrap metal. Villagers shared food with soldiers passing through. The army learned to fight smarter. They adapted. They hardened. By late 1942, they were no longer falling back. They were ready to push forward. From broken ground, steel can rise again. The Battle of Stalingrad. The name Stalingrad echoes through history like a cold wind. In the summer of 1942, the Germans reached the city on the Volga River. It was industrial, sprawling, and symbolic. Hitler wanted it taken. Stalin would not let it fall. The battle began with bombs. Entire districts were flattened. But the Soviets did not flee. They dug in street by street, room by room. Combat was fought inside buildings. Basements became bunkers. Factories became front lines. The German advance slowed, then stopped, then turned to retreat. Encircled in the winter, without supplies, the Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943. Over 2 million lives were lost in this single battle. But it marked a turning point, not just in geography, but in momentum. In the ashes of Stalingrad, history turned. Winter becomes a weapon. Russia's greatest ally has never carried a gun. It is winter. When the Germans invaded, they brought speed and firepower. But they did not bring coats, not warm enough ones anyway. As temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius, tanks froze, guns jammed. Men died without ever seeing the enemy. The snow fell without sound. The wind carved through skin like glass. The Soviets, used to such weather, moved with quiet confidence. They used sleds instead of trucks. They built fires in ways that wouldn't smoke. They waited. And when they struck with nature at their side. In Russia, winter does not fight. It waits. War on the rails. On the Eastern Front, distance was a silent enemy. The land stretched endlessly, forests, rivers, plains. And so, the war depended on one thing: trains. Trains brought soldiers to the front. Trains delivered tanks, food, ammunition. They moved across fragile bridges and frozen rails. The Soviets relied on wide-gauge tracks. The Germans used narrower ones. So when Germany captured territory, they had to rebuild the rails behind them, slowing everything down. Partisans attacked the lines, sabotaged switches, destroyed tunnels. Every train that arrived was a quiet victory. Everyone that didn't, a message sent without a word. In a war of distance, steel rails held the weight of hope, snipers in the snow. In the ruined cities of the Eastern Front, snipers became legends. They moved like shadows, waited in silence, and struck with perfect stillness. One of the most famous was Vasily Zaitsev, a hunter turned soldier. At Stalingrad, he reportedly killed over 200 enemy troops. Not with rage, but with calm. Not with noise, but with patience. Snipers turned buildings into mazes. A shattered window became a warning. A flicker of movement. A final breath. They fought alone, but not for themselves. They were the eyes of the army. And in their silence, they changed the shape of battle. In stillness, precision becomes power. Civilians in the crossfire. For civilians caught between the clashing armies, there were no uniforms, no ranks, only survival. Villages disappeared overnight. Families fled with nothing but blankets. Mothers carried babies through forests. Children walked behind carts, shoeless, in the snow. Homes became ruins. Churches became shelters, and every meal was a prayer. Some were captured, others were conscripted. Many were simply forgotten. But even in the face of unthinkable suffering, they held on. They buried the dead. They sang lullabies to quiet fear. They told stories in whispers. In the worst of times, the ordinary become extraordinary. The human cost. When the war finally ended, the Eastern Front had taken over 30 million lives. Cities were flattened. Rivers ran with ash. Fields turned into graveyards. But the cost was not just in numbers. It was in memories never made, songs never sung, children never born. The survivors carried scars, some on their skin, many more in silence. Photographs were buried in the rubble. Letters were lost to time. Entire languages disappeared from certain villages. And yet, even through that heartbreak, people began again. They planted seeds. They rebuilt homes. They told the stories. And in doing so, they made sure we would remember. Some victories are measured not by what is won, but by what is survived. A morning at Pearl Harbor. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, December 7th, 1941. The air was warm, the sky was clear, and the harbor was calm, filled with anchored ships, still and unsuspecting. Then, like a sudden storm, it came. Japanese planes, dozens, then hundreds, descended from the sky. Their engines roared over mountains and sea. They struck without warning. In just under 2 hours, the heart of the American Pacific Fleet was devastated. Battleships burned, smoke rose in dark columns, and the air, once filled with birds and breezes, now shook with fire and steel. More than 2,400 lives were lost. And in that moment, the world changed. Until then, the United States had remained neutral, watching the war unfold from afar. But Pearl Harbor made the choice for them. The very next day, America entered World War II. That peaceful harbor, once a symbol of paradise, had become the place where history turned. Some days split history in two. Japan's expanding empire. Before Pearl Harbor, Japan was already on the move. Driven by ambition and a hunger for resources, the Japanese empire had been expanding, first into China, then deeper into Southeast Asia. In just months, they swept through the Pacific. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, each fell quickly and often with little resistance. The speed was shocking. It felt like an unstoppable tide. Japanese forces believed in striking fast, before their enemies could prepare. They used the element of surprise, discipline, and brutal efficiency. But every empire has a limit. And the more Japan spread, the more vulnerable it became. Each island captured had to be held. Each victory invited resistance. And as the months passed, that tide, so strong at first, began to slow. Even waves can rise too high before they fall. War across water. The Pacific War was not like the one in Europe. There were no long roads through cities, no sweeping fronts across borders. This was a war of islands and oceans and silence. Thousands of miles separated each battlefield. Armies moved not by trains, but by ships. Battles took place in jungles, on atolls, and in the skies above blue horizons. Soldiers endured extreme heat, rain, and insects. Supplies were hard to deliver. Communication was slow. Victories were measured in yards, not miles. Fights lasted for weeks on islands no one had heard of, and many would never hear of again. And in the space between those islands, there was only water, vast, endless, deep. On water and in silence, the war moved like the tide. The Battle of Midway. In June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan set its sights on a small island called Midway. It was remote, just a dot in the Pacific. But strategically, it was everything. Japan hoped to lure the US fleet into a trap, but unknown to them, American codebreakers had uncovered the plan. The trap had been reversed. When the battle came, it happened mostly in the air. Aircraft from carriers fought above the waves, searching for their targets. It was fast, intense, and over in days. The Japanese Navy lost 4 aircraft carriers, a blow it would never fully recover from. And with that loss, the momentum of the war began to shift. Midway wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. Proof that even the smallest island could shape the ocean around it. A single island in a vast ocean changed the course of the sea. The Jungle War. Some battles were not fought on beaches or in the air. They were fought deep in jungles, where the trees swallowed light and sound. In places like the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, soldiers faced not just bullets, but the environment itself. The jungle was alive. It was hot, wet, endless. Every step was heavy. Every day, a struggle against disease, exhaustion, and fear. Malaria spread through camps like whispers. Leeches clung to skin. The humidity soaked through uniforms, through maps, through letters from home. Fighting was sudden, ambushes in the trees, silent movements in the brush. The jungle made everything closer, personal, hidden. And those who fought there carried it with them forever. In the green silence, even a whisper of courage echoes loud. Kamikaze pilots. In the final years of the war, Japan turned to a desperate strategy. Kamikaze, the divine wind. Pilots, often young, were trained for one final mission: to fly their planes directly into enemy ships with no intention of returning. It was a tactic born not only from strategy, but from sorrow, from pride, and from hopelessness. Some kamikaze pilots wrote letters to their families. Some composed poems. Many cried quietly before takeoff. They were not monsters, they were sons, students, dreamers, and their final acts were not of rage, but of ritual. Their planes soared low over the ocean, and then disappeared in flame. Some fought with wings and flame, others with fate. Island hopping. The United States and its allies developed a strategy called island hopping. Instead of capturing every single island held by Japan, they chose key ones, leaping from one to the next, closer and closer to Japan. Each island was a step. They built airstrips, cut off supplies, and skipped over strongholds that no longer mattered once isolated. It was slow and costly, but it worked. From Guadalcanal to Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Each name became a chapter, each beach a story, and with every hop, the war moved closer to Japan's shores. Across the ocean, the path was made of footprints in sand. The surrender of the Philippines. In early 1942, American and Filipino forces surrendered at Bataan. Exhausted, undersupplied, surrounded. What followed was the Bataan Death March. Tens of thousands were forced to walk for days under a brutal sun. Many died along the way, from thirst, from beatings, from collapse. But the story didn't end there. 3 years later, the Allies returned. The Philippines were retaken, one island, one city, one step at a time. The people who had endured captivity, occupation, and loss were finally free. And though the scars remained, so did the pride. Not all returns are loud. Some arrive with honor and hush. The firebombing of Tokyo. On the night of March 9th, 1945, the city of Tokyo burned. American bombers flying low dropped thousands of incendiary bombs. The city, made mostly of wood and paper, became an inferno. The fire spread faster than people could run. Whole neighborhoods vanished in minutes. The wind carried embers through alleyways and rooftops. More than 100,000 people died that night. Mothers, children, elders, lost in flame. The fire was relentless, and when it was over, Tokyo was quiet, flattened, still. More died that night than in either atomic bombing, but this fire left no flash, only a slow, smothering storm. Sometimes destruction is not thunder, it is wind and ash. Japan's reluctant end. By the summer of 1945, Japan was weary, its empire shrinking, its cities burning, its people hungry. But surrender did not come. Then came Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. 2 flashes of light, 2 mushroom clouds, and 2 cities gone. Over 200,000 lives were lost from those bombs, many instantly, others over time. It was unimaginable, and it was enough. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke directly to his people, for the first time ever. His voice was calm, measured, and filled with sorrow. Japan surrendered, and the world exhaled. A quiet voice ended a war that roared. The War of Ideas. World War II was not only a clash of nations and soldiers, it was a clash of minds. In laboratories, workshops, and drafting rooms across the globe, engineers, scientists, cryptographers, and inventors worked quietly behind the scenes. Their battlefields were not muddy fields or frozen trenches. They were blackboards, code books, and glowing filaments. In this war, the most dangerous ideas often came not with a bang, but with a whisper. Some studied how to intercept enemy signals. Others puzzled over how to make airplanes faster, lighter, stronger. How to crack codes, how to guide torpedoes, how to stop blood loss, how to feed soldiers in the jungle with food that would not spoil, how to protect a convoy of ships using invisible waves of sound. The war of ideas was a race, of time, of intellect, of unseen hands shaping what would happen next. And sometimes, the smallest idea, a line of code, a new formula, a better boot sole, could ripple out and change the fate of thousands. This quiet war of minds didn't have flags or fanfare, but it mattered, deeply. Some of the most powerful weapons are never loud, they are born in thought. The invention of radar. In the early days of the war, there was a new kind of vision rising, one that could see through fog, cloud, and night. It was called radar, short for radio detection and ranging. This was a revolution in silence. Invisible radio waves were sent out into the air. If they struck something, a plane, a ship, they bounced back. And suddenly, things that could not be seen could be known. In Britain, radar became a quiet shield. Tall towers lined the coast, sending out pulses like heartbeat signals. Operators, often young women sitting in dim rooms, listened to the blips on their screens and warned of approaching aircraft. During the Battle of Britain, these few extra minutes, 10, sometimes 20, gave British fighter pilots time to climb into the sky. Time to prepare, time to survive. Radar didn't shoot or explode. It simply watched. And in doing so, it changed everything. The unseen can sometimes be what saves us. The Enigma machine. It looked almost like a typewriter, a box of keys and switches and spinning metal wheels. But it held secrets deeper than any weapon. It was called Enigma, and it was used by Nazi Germany to encrypt its most critical military messages. Every day the code changed, and with each message sent, a new puzzle was born. The Germans believed it was unbreakable. But in a quiet country estate in England, Bletchley Park, a team of thinkers and dreamers set out to prove them wrong. Among them was Alan Turing, a mathematician, quiet and brilliant. With a team of codebreakers, he built machines that could run through millions of possible combinations, not in weeks or days, but in minutes. With each decrypted message, lives were saved, convoys rerouted, ambushes avoided, secrets revealed. The code breaking at Bletchley Park shortened the war, some say by 2 years, but its true value can't be measured in time alone, because behind every message was a life, and behind every life, a future that might now be lived. To defeat the storm, sometimes you must first learn to read its winds. Deception as strategy. Not every weapon in war explodes, some simply confuse. Deception has always been part of warfare, but in World War II it became an art form. One of the greatest examples was Operation Fortitude, a plan designed to mislead the Germans about where the Allies would land in France. They created an entire fake army. Inflatable tanks were set up in fields. Wooden aircraft sat at fake airstrips. Actors posed as generals. Radio operators transmitted fake orders for entire divisions that didn't exist. All to convince the enemy that the D-Day landings would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. And it worked. The Germans concentrated their defences in the wrong place, and when the real invasion came, they were unprepared. This was war not of bullets, but of belief. And in that war, the truth became a kind of camouflage. In war, sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight. The Ghost Army. In 1944, a special American unit landed in Europe, but they did not come to fight in the usual sense. They came to pretend. They were artists, sound engineers, set designers. Their mission: to deceive. They were called the Ghost Army. They used inflatable tanks that looked real from the air. Truckloads of speakers blasted recordings of troop movements, engine noise, and shouted orders, all pre-recorded. They even wore fake uniforms and held fake briefings in bars near enemy spies. They staged illusions on a battlefield that stretched across the imagination. Their operations misled the Germans dozens of times, convincing them of attacks that never came. and drawing troops away from the real ones that did. These men never fired a shot, but they saved lives. By using light, sound, and story, some warriors fight with silence and illusion and still change the field. The rise of aerial warfare. Before World War II, flight was still young, but by the time it ended, the sky had become a central battlefield. Fighter planes danced in the clouds. Bombers flew across entire countries in hours. And for the first time, war came not just from the land, but from above. Cities that once seemed untouchable were now within reach. No wall was tall enough, no sea wide enough. And so the skies filled with formations of B-17s, of Spitfires, of Messerschmitts and Mustangs. In the Pacific, aircraft carriers became floating airstrips, launching planes into blue nothingness to search, strike, and return. Aerial warfare brought a new kind of fear, but it also brought new kinds of heroes. Pilots, often young, flew alone for hours. They faced the wind, the cold, the silence. They made decisions in seconds that would be remembered for lifetimes. Above the world, battle became quiet and endless. Submarines in the deep. Far below the surface of the sea, in total darkness, a different kind of war was fought. Submarines. Quiet, hidden, deadly. German U-boats haunted the Atlantic, moving in packs, hunting Allied convoys. They would surface under the moonlight, fire torpedoes, and vanish beneath the waves. For a while, they ruled the seas, but the Allies adapted. New sonar technology, depth charges, escort ships. In the Pacific, American submarines cut through Japanese supply lines like blades. They waited for hours, moved slowly, struck with precision. Life inside a sub was cramped. The air was stale, the space tight, the silence constant. But the men who served in those steel tubes carried out missions that changed the course of the war. In darkness and silence, some battles are held beneath the breath of the ocean. The Manhattan Project. It began in secret, across the deserts of New Mexico, under universities in Chicago and California, and in a hidden city in Tennessee. Scientists worked on something new, something vast and dangerous. They called it the Manhattan Project. It brought together some of the greatest minds in physics: Oppenheimer, Fermi, Bohr, Einstein. Their goal was to harness the power of the atom, to split it, and release the energy within. In July 1945, in the quiet stillness of the desert, they tested their creation. The ground shook, the sky flashed, and history changed. It was the birth of the atomic bomb. Some cheered, some wept. Oppenheimer would later recall a line from ancient scripture: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This was the war's most powerful invention, and its most haunting legacy. Science is not always progress. Sometimes it is a question left hanging in the air. Body armor, rations, and boots. War is not only won with grand machines. Sometimes it's won with the smallest things. Boots that keep out water. Rations that don't spoil in heat. A helmet shaped just right to deflect a falling shard. World War II saw the quiet rise of personal technology. Things worn, carried, consumed. Soldiers were issued new canteens, foldable shovels, gas masks, and field bandages. Medic kits were redesigned. Shoes were adapted for desert, jungle, and snow. Even chewing gum was issued to pilots to help their ears adjust to pressure changes. Every detail mattered. Every improvement could mean life instead of death. These tools weren't celebrated. They weren't glamorous. But they were there, in the mud, the heat, the silence. Sometimes the tools that matter most are the ones that seem the smallest. The constant shift of tactics. War is movement, not just of troops, but of thought. As battles were fought, lessons were learned. Tactics shifted. What failed was left behind. What worked was refined. Germany began with blitzkrieg, fast, overwhelming strikes. The Soviets learned to fight in cities, in factories, in snow. The Allies mastered coordination, air, sea, and land. Each side watched the others. Each battle taught something. Sometimes too late. The war became a living thing, adapting, evolving, reshaping itself each day, and those who couldn't change were left behind. This was not the war anyone expected, but it became the one they had to survive. War teaches change. Peace teaches why we needed it. The war at home. While soldiers marched across continents, another war unfolded in living rooms and kitchens. This was the war of waiting, of ration books and blackout curtains, of letters from faraway places. Some answered, some never returned. In Britain, the US, the Soviet Union, and countries across the world, people adapted their lives around the war. Children practiced air raid drills. Mothers took factory jobs. Fathers taught younger siblings how to grow potatoes in backyards and vacant lots. There was a strange kind of courage in this daily life. Not the kind that makes headlines, but the quiet kind that endures. To keep going, to keep hoping, to hang curtains over broken windows and sweep ash from the floor, and then set the table as if it was just another Tuesday. Some battles are fought not with weapons, but with resilience. Victory gardens. In parks, schoolyards, and tiny apartment courtyards, something green began to grow. They were called victory gardens, planted not by farmers, but by neighbours, families, and schoolchildren. They were a way to stretch rations, a way to contribute, a way to stay rooted in something that felt human. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, and squash filled city spaces that had once been idle. In London, gardens sprouted where bombs had left craters. In New York, families grew herbs on fire escapes. The soil became a quiet act of defiance, a way to say, we're still here, we still eat, we still live. More than food, these gardens offered comfort, routine, and the slow, hopeful joy of watching something grow. In a world torn apart, a seed was still a promise. Rationing and resourcefulness. With so much of the world's resources diverted to the war effort, governments turned to rationing, sugar, butter, meat, coffee, even shoes and tires. People learned to make do, and then to make better with less. Wartime cookbooks were filled with recipes for dishes that stretched what little was available. Carrot cake made without sugar, meatloaf with oatmeal, coffee brewed from roasted chicory root. Children grew up never tasting chocolate. Mothers saved every scrap of string. Old clothing was unstitched and turned into something new. There was pride in being clever, pride in waste, nothing. And across countries, people discovered that community could bloom out of shared need. Scarcity became a classroom, and everyone learned how to give more with less. Women in the workforce. As men went to war, millions of women stepped into roles they'd never held before. In factories, they welded steel beams. In shipyards, they built destroyers. They drove ambulances, repaired planes, delivered mail, and flew supply missions. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol, rolled up sleeves, red scarf, and strength in her eyes. But she wasn't just an image. She was real. Her name was Helen, Maria, Evelyn, Sophia. She had children, a garden, a dream. And every morning, she walked into a place where only men had worked before, and she proved she belonged. After the war, many women were expected to return to their old roles. But the world had shifted, and though quiet, the sound of women building the future never stopped. The war asked them to help. They answered by changing history. Childhood in wartime. For millions of children, the war was their entire world. They learned their alphabet under blackout curtains, played games while sirens howled in the distance, went to bed not with bedtime stories, but with gas masks nearby. In London, many children were evacuated to the countryside, sent by train, wearing tags, carrying little more than a sandwich and a small suitcase. Some returned after years, some never returned at all. In other places, children survived bombings, occupied cities, or walked miles beside fleeing families. Yet somehow, they still played, still dreamed. A tin can became a toy. A chalk drawing on a bomb shelter wall became a window into another world. And when peace finally came, they were already years older. Childhood didn't disappear. It simply learned how to hide. Everyday resilience. The war crept into everything, into routines, rhythms, rituals. And so, people adjusted. They shared recipes, stories, and coal. They picked each other up from rubble-strewn sidewalks and held one another when the world trembled. Laundry still needed to be done. Birthdays still came. Windows still needed cleaning, even if they no longer had glass. Across towns and cities, communities grew stronger, not in spite of war, but because of it. People wrote to strangers. They took in the children of neighbors. They turned basements into classrooms, churches into shelters, and dinner tables into planning boards for whatever came next. It wasn't about bravery. It was about choosing life again and again. The world didn't stop. It adapted. And in that, it found quiet strength, music and morale. Even in the darkest days, music found a way in. In London, as bombs fell above, people gathered in the underground stations and sang. In New York, jazz clubs stayed open late, offering rhythm and relief. In Berlin, lullabies whispered in basements offered the only calm some children knew. Songs became lifelines, messages, reminders of who we were before the war and who we still hope to be after. Soldiers carried harmonicas in their pockets. Nurses hummed tunes as they cleaned wounds. Radio broadcasts brought familiar melodies to distant battlefields. In a world of rationing and rubble, a single song could remind someone that they were still human. Music didn't fight the war. It simply refused to let it take everything. Letters from the front. The war stretched across oceans and borders, but letters still found their way. Each envelope carried more than words. They carried presence. A fold of paper that said, "I'm alive. I miss you. I'm trying to stay strong." Soldiers wrote with pencils in trenches, with typewriters in tents, with trembling hands during moments of rare peace. And those who waited, mothers, spouses, children, would read each line again and again, looking for meaning between the sentences. Some letters arrived with joyful news, others brought heartbreak. Some arrived long after the war had ended, or never arrived at all. But for a moment, in a world so fractured, a letter could stitch two people back together. Ink became a lifeline, and paper, a place to come home to. Propaganda and hope. In every country, the war was not just fought on the battlefield. It was fought in the mind. Posters told people to save food, to stay quiet, to buy bonds. Films and cartoons explained the war and why it had to be fought. Speeches were broadcast over radio waves to remind people what they were enduring it all for. And while some of it was exaggeration, and some was untrue, much of it was meant to offer hope. Images of smiling workers, of united nations, of a world beyond the war, peaceful, clean, and waiting to be rebuilt. Propaganda may have bent reality. But for people living in bomb shelters or worrying over absent loved ones, those bright, bold messages on walls and screens were sometimes all they had. Even the idea of hope can be enough to keep someone moving. Dreams of peace. Even as battles raged, people dreamed of what would come next. They dreamed of homecomings, of rebuilding, of a future where sirens no longer meant danger and quiet no longer meant fear. Some made lists of things they would do once the war was over. Walk in the park again. Drink real coffee. Write a book. Sing loudly in a room with open windows. Children dreamed of fathers returning. Lovers dreamed of weddings. And soldiers, even in foxholes, sometimes looked at the stars, and imagined a time when those same constellations would shine over a different world. When peace came, it would not erase what had happened, but it would give people the chance to begin again. In the heart of war, peace is not just an end, it is a promise. The shadow falls. As war spread across Europe, another darkness moved quietly behind it. Calculated, cold, and deliberate. It was not a battlefront. It was not a military campaign. It was the systematic persecution and murder of millions. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It began with words, with laws, with neighbors turning away. Jews were forced to wear yellow stars. Their businesses were taken. Their rights vanished slowly, until one day, their names did too. First came the ghettos, then the trains, then the camps. This was not just war, it was genocide. And while the world fought armies, something else was happening in the shadows. Not all violence makes noise. Some of it moves in silence until it's too late. Life in the ghettos. In cities across occupied Europe, Jewish ghettos were established. Walls rose, gates locked, streets were sealed off from the rest of the world. Inside, families lived in overcrowded apartments, sometimes 10 to a room. Food was scarce, medicine rarer still. But even in that forced confinement, life continued. Children played with scraps and stories. People taught in secret schools. Rabbis held quiet services. Writers kept diaries. The Warsaw Ghetto held hundreds of thousands in a space built for thousands. But in its narrow streets, there was not only suffering, there was strength. To live a normal life under those conditions became an act of resistance. In a place built to erase identity, people held tightly to who they were. The trains, they arrived without warning. Cattle cars, freight wagons, crowded, sealed, dark. Men, women, and children were packed tightly together, often for days. No food, no water. Only the sound of wheels turning and the whisper of guesses. Where are we going? What will happen? Some knew, most didn't. The trains went to names now etched into history: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek. For many, the journey was the end. For others, it was the beginning of something even harder. Steel wheels carried silence across nations and left it behind at their destinations. The camps, behind barbed wire and concrete, concentration camps and death camps were built not just to imprison, but to erase. Families were separated at arrival, some sent one way, some another. Those deemed too weak to work were killed within hours. Others were assigned to labor, starvation, cold, Auschwitz, a name that holds millions of stories, most of them never told. There were no names in the camp, only numbers, tattooed on skin, written on lists. And yet, even in that place, small acts of humanity persisted. A shared crust of bread, a whispered prayer, a lullaby sung by someone who still remembered love. Even where the world broke, pieces of dignity remained. Hidden testimonies. Some who endured the camps kept journals, scratched on scraps of paper, hidden in cracks between bricks, buried beneath barracks. They wrote not to survive, but to be remembered, to leave behind proof. In the Warsaw Ghetto, a historian named Emanuel Ringelblum created a secret archive, preserving stories, drawings, poems, recipes, names. The documents were buried in milk cans and metal boxes beneath rubble and floorboards. Years later, they were found. These voices, meant to be silenced, were still speaking. Even when bodies were taken, stories refused to disappear. The rescuers, not everyone stood by. Across Europe, there were those who hid families in basements, barns, and behind walls. They risked everything: their homes, their freedom, their lives. Some were farmers, priests, school teachers, neighbors. In the Netherlands, a teenage girl named Miep Gies helped hide the Frank family. In Denmark, An entire nation ferried nearly all of its Jewish population to safety across the sea. They were not many, but they mattered. The rescuers did not end the Holocaust, but they stood against it. And that too was a kind of victory. To protect one life is to protect the world entire. Resistance from within. Even in the camps, even in the ghettos, resistance lived. There were uprisings. At Sobibor, prisoners overpowered guards and fled. In Treblinka, gas chambers were set aflame. In Auschwitz, a crematorium was blown up by inmates, many of them young women. In the Warsaw Ghetto, with barely any weapons, people fought for weeks against overwhelming odds. These were not warriors. They were tailors, teachers, teenagers. They fought because they had to, because silence had already taken so much. They may not have survived, but they made sure they would not be forgotten. Liberation and evidence. In 1945, Allied forces began reaching the camps, and what they found was beyond imagining. Barbed wire, emaciated survivors, ash where people once lived. Soldiers took photographs. They brought in doctors, journalists, witnesses, not just to heal, but to record. Because they knew one day someone would say it never happened. And so they documented everything, carefully, solemnly, with hands shaking behind the lenses. The gates of camps were opened, but the weight of what had happened inside them would never be fully lifted. The truth had to be remembered, because forgetting would be the final wound. Aftermath and memory. For survivors, liberation was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning of living again, after so much had been lost. They had no homes to return to, no families, no cities that looked the same. But they rebuilt. They told their stories. They held each other. They moved forward with quiet strength, carrying scars, yes, but also wisdom. They built museums, held ceremonies, lit candles, and they reminded the world, never again, not just as a slogan, but as a sacred promise. Memory became their monument, and their resistance never ended. The power of remembrance. The Holocaust cannot be undone, but it must be remembered. Every name, every voice, every life taken, and every life saved. Across the world, memorials stand not in triumph, but in silence. Yad Vashem, the US Holocaust Memorial. Stolperstein, small brass stones embedded in sidewalks where victims once lived. Children learn the names. Survivors speak when they can. And candles are lit not just in mourning, but in defiance, because remembrance is not just looking back. It is choosing to see, to feel, to say, this happened. And we will not look away. When we remember, we keep the light on, for those who were led into darkness. Stalingrad, the frozen turning point. By the winter of 1942, the war in the East had become unbearable. In the city of Stalingrad, the streets were filled not with traffic, but with rubble. Buildings had no roofs. Rooms had no walls. Every floor was a battlefield. German forces had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, but the resistance was unrelenting. The Red Army fought from staircases and sewers. Every hallway was contested. Every inch was paid for in blood and cold. And then, in the heart of winter, the tide turned. Soviet troops surrounded the German Sixth Army. Supplies were cut off. Temperatures dropped below freezing. After months of brutal fighting, the Germans surrendered, exhausted, starving, defeated. Stalingrad had not only survived, it had changed the course of the war. From frozen stone and fire, history shifted its weight. The Battle of the Atlantic begins to turn. For years, Allied ships crossing the Atlantic faced a silent threat. German U-boats. They hunted in packs, sinking merchant ships without warning. It was called the Battle of the Atlantic, and for a long time, the outcome was uncertain. But by 1943, something changed. New technology, sonar, radar, Depth charges allowed Allied ships to detect submarines before they struck. Convoys began traveling with stronger escorts. Air patrols extended further over the sea. The hunters became the hunted. By mid-1943, U-boat losses were so high that Germany pulled many of them back. The supply lines were no longer bleeding. Food, fuel, and troops could now cross the ocean in safety. And the war effort surged forward. The sea, once silent and deadly, began to carry hope instead of fear. North Africa, the Desert War, turns. In the sands of North Africa, tanks moved like ships across golden waves. Here, battles were fought beneath endless skies. The heat shimmered, dust clung to every surface. And still, the war raged on. At first, German General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, seemed unstoppable. His forces swept across Libya and Egypt, outmaneuvering the Allies at every turn. But then came El Alamein. In October 1942, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery launched a fierce counter-offensive. They had learned. They had prepared. And they pushed the Axis forces back. It was the beginning of the end for German control in Africa. Soon after, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. The two armies moved like closing jaws, and the desert campaign was over. The sands shifted, and with them, the war's momentum. The Pacific fights back. After Pearl Harbor, the Pacific had seemed lost. Island after island fell to Japanese forces. Hope felt distant, like the shores of another world. But in June 1942, the United States struck back. The Battle of Midway was short, fierce, and transformative. With clever code breaking, the US had learned of Japan's plans and prepared an ambush. In a matter of days, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers. Its offensive momentum was gone. From there, the Allies began moving, island by island, step by step, through jungle, reef, and volcanic rock. It was slow. It was brutal. But it was forward. The tide had turned. Across the Pacific, each island retaken was a lantern lit on the path to peace. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. In July 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. It was the first major step into mainland Europe. Troops landed under cover of darkness. Paratroopers dropped silently behind enemy lines. Within days, ports were secured, airfields captured. The campaign was swift, and it shook the Axis powers. Inside Italy, people began to question the war. Mussolini was arrested. The government began negotiating with the Allies, and soon the Italian front opened, stretching Germany even thinner. One island, one landing, one step closer. Italy switches sides. Italy had entered the war as part of the Axis. Under Benito Mussolini, it had invaded countries, allied with Hitler, and marched beneath fascist banners. But after the fall of Sicily, everything began to unravel. In September 1943, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies, and just like that, the front lines blurred. German forces rushed in to occupy northern Italy. The country was split in two. Some Italians continued to fight for the Axis. Others joined the resistance, or the Allies. Civilians were caught in the middle, a country divided by loyalty and by grief. But Italy's switch weakened Hitler. It opened new fronts, and it showed the world the Axis alliance was not invincible. Even in war, allegiances can shift, and with them, fate. D-Day is decided. By 1944, the Allies had been planning something enormous, a return to mainland Europe. It was known as Operation Overlord, but history remembers it as D-Day. The decision wasn't made lightly. Storms, logistics, timelines, how to move hundreds of thousands of troops, tanks, planes, and supplies across the English Channel and land them on beaches filled with defences. Commanders met in secret. Maps were drawn, soldiers trained, rehearsed, waited, and finally, the date was chosen, June 6th, 1944. The world didn't know it yet. But everything was about to change. Some decisions echo louder than explosions. D-Day, the longest day. In the early morning darkness of June 6, 1944, the sea was rough. Rain fell. Waves rocked small landing craft filled with soldiers from across the world. Then came the signal. From the sky, paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. From the sea, ships approached the French coast. Beaches with names now etched in memory. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Bullets met them. Mines exploded beneath their feet. And yet, they came ashore. Row by row, step by step. By nightfall, the Allies had established a foothold in Normandy. It was the beginning of the end, not just of the occupation, but of the war itself. On that day, courage crossed the sea and never looked back. The French resistance rises before the Allies landed. Others were already fighting. The French resistance had grown quietly, in back alleys, barns, cellars, and schools. They passed messages, sabotaged railroads, blew up bridges, guided lost pilots to safety. Some were former soldiers, some were farmers, many were students. Some were barely out of childhood. They had no uniforms, no tanks, only courage. When the Allies landed, the resistance rose up, disrupting German forces, guiding Allied troops, reclaiming their cities street by street. They were the heartbeat of France, beating through silence and occupation. Sometimes the bravest army wears no badge at all. Paris is liberated. In August 1944, after 4 long years of occupation, Paris was free again. The resistance had risen. The Allies had arrived. And the German garrison, surrounded and exhausted, surrendered. People poured into the streets. They waved flags, kissed strangers, wept in public. The bells of Notre Dame rang out across the city. Shouts of "Liberté" filled the air. Soldiers danced with civilians. And for a moment, joy returned to a world that had forgotten how it felt. It wasn't the end of the war, but it was the beginning of something new. A city once darkened by silence had found its voice again and sang. The Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, as snow fell gently across the forests of Belgium, a surprise came through the trees. German tanks, hidden by fog, broke through Allied lines in a final desperate push. It was Hitler's last major offensive in the West, and it came with thunder. They called it the Battle of the Bulge because of the shape it made on the map. A deep swell in the front line, a sudden bend in the road to peace. For weeks, the fighting was fierce. In the town of Bastogne, American soldiers held out in freezing conditions, surrounded, short on supplies, but unwilling to give up. Eventually, the skies cleared. Allied planes returned. The German advance slowed, then stopped, then broke. The bulge had been pushed back. And after that, Germany had no strength left to launch anything new. Even the last breath of a storm must give way to quiet. The bombing of Dresden. In February 1945, the war neared its end, but not its mercy. The city of Dresden, once filled with art, music, and Baroque architecture, was bombed over the course of 2 nights. British and American bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives and firebombs. The city burned. Flames rose in walls. Air was sucked from shelters. The firestorm grew so hot it melted stone. Tens of thousands died, most of them civilians. To this day, historians debate the military necessity of the bombing. But those who lived through it, or beneath it, remember it as a night the stars fell. Even in the final hour, war can still forget the line between victory and vengeance. The Soviet advance. While the Allies pushed in from the west, the Red Army surged from the east, through Poland, through the Baltics, through ruins and resistance. The Soviet advance was massive and relentless, town after town, bridge after bridge, until only Berlin remained. But this too came at a cost. Entire cities were destroyed. Civilians were caught between collapsing lines, and the memory of German brutality in the East left deep scars and deeper revenge. Still, the Soviets pressed forward, and with each step, the Nazi regime shrank, its power collapsing like a dying echo. The footsteps of justice sometimes sound like thunder. The fall of Berlin. In April 1945, the war reached its final city. Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, was surrounded. Soviet artillery thundered through the streets. Buildings fell like paper. The once proud capital turned to smoke and stone. Inside, Hitler remained in his bunker. He gave final orders. And then, on April 30th, he died, by his own hand. Outside, the fighting continued, street by street, block by block. And then, silence. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. The city stood broken, but the war, at least in Europe, was almost over. The walls of an empire had finally crumbled, not with ceremony, but with ruin. Germany surrenders. On May 7th, 1945, in a small room in Reims, France, a German general signed the official act of surrender. The following day, May 8th, was declared Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. In London, church bells rang for hours. In Paris, crowds filled the streets. In Moscow, fireworks lit up the night. People wept, laughed, embraced strangers. The war in Europe was over. And though battles still raged in the Pacific, a corner of the world exhaled. The silence, after so much sound, was overwhelming. Peace, when it finally came, felt almost too quiet to believe. The camps are liberated. As Allied forces swept through Europe, they began to discover what had been hidden. The concentration camps. At first, they didn't understand what they were seeing. The skeletal survivors, the piles of shoes, the ash. Then came the truth. American troops liberated Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen. The Soviets reached Majdanek and Auschwitz. Photographs were taken, doctors arrived, and the world was forced to see. The survivors, many near death, were offered blankets, food, water, and most of all, the knowledge that someone had come for them. It was too late for millions, but for those who remained, the gates were opened, and the nightmare, at last, was over. The end of the war was not a celebration for all. For some, it was simply the return of breath. The atomic bomb is tested. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the sky turned white. It was called Trinity, the first test of an atomic bomb. Scientists had worked for years in secrecy, building something they barely understood. When it exploded, the blast was brighter than the sun. The ground shook, the air pulsed, and the world changed. Some cheered. Some stood in silence. Oppenheimer, one of the creators, whispered words from ancient scripture. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The weapon worked. And soon, the choice will be made to use it. Sometimes, the future arrives not with footsteps, but with a flash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima woke like any other day. Children walked to school, shops opened, the sky was clear. Then, at 8:15 a.m., everything changed. The first atomic bomb fell, and in seconds, the city disappeared beneath a blinding flash. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Together, they killed over 200,000 people, many instantly, others slowly, silently. The buildings were gone. The shadows of people burned into walls, and a new kind of silence settled over the world, one shaped by ash and grief. The bombs ended the war, but they began something else too, a reminder that humanity had reached a place where it could destroy itself, and had to choose not to. Japan surrenders. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. The war that had spanned 6 years, 6 continents, and over 70 million lives was ending. Emperor Hirohito addressed his people in a radio broadcast, the first time they had ever heard his voice. It was calm, measured, filled with sorrow. The words were simple. We have decided to effect a settlement. On September 2nd, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, the formal surrender was signed. Flags were lowered, weapons laid down. The world, stunned and shaken, stood on the edge of peace. It was not loud, it was not triumphant, but it was real, and it was time. The war is over. It was over. After 6 years of conflict, after cities burned and skies turned dark, after oceans were crossed and nations occupied and millions lost, the war was over. And in that stillness, people tried to remember how to live. Soldiers came home. Some found their houses standing. Some did not. Families were reunited. Some met new children for the first time. Others stood at empty stations. There were parades, weddings, silences too deep for words. The world had changed, and now it had to rebuild. The war had ended, but the work of peace was only just beginning. Rebuilding the ruins. When the war ended, cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruin. Streets once filled with markets and music were now rubble. Homes were gone, churches crumbled, factories silent. But from the dust, life began again. In Warsaw, children carried bricks to help rebuild. In Tokyo, bamboo scaffolding rose beside shattered temples. In London, flower stalls returned to street corners where bombs once fell. It was slow, uneven, but it was something. There were no blueprints for how to heal a broken world, only determination. Piece by piece, stone by stone, the world didn't start over, it started forward. The Nuremberg trials. For the first time in human history, war crimes were put on public trial. In Nuremberg, Germany, an international court brought Nazi leaders to face justice. They were charged not just with crimes against soldiers, but against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. Footage of the camps, testimony from survivors, mountains of documents. Some denied, some blamed others, some admitted everything. And the world watched, not for vengeance, but for truth. These trials established a new idea, that no leader, no soldier, no government was above morality. Justice had spoken, and from its echo, a new kind of law was born. The United Nations is born. After 2 world wars, the world finally asked, how do we stop this from happening again? The answer, or at least the hope, became the United Nations, founded in 1945. 50 nations gathered, not to divide land or declare war, but to build peace. They created a council, a charter, a promise that diplomacy would replace destruction, that human rights would be protected, not ignored, that the world would talk before it fired. It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase conflict, but it was a start, a symbol that even after all the loss, the world still believed in cooperation. And that belief was powerful. New borders, new tensions. When the war ended, maps were redrawn. Germany was divided. Korea was split in 2. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence. Old empires dissolved, and new nations were born. But peace did not mean harmony. A Cold War soon began, a quiet global tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. No bombs fell, but fear lingered. Spies replaced soldiers. Ideologies collided, and the scars of World War II shaped the decades to come, where every new conflict carried echoes of the last. The world was no longer burning, but it was still heating up. The soldiers return. Home. After the war, millions of soldiers returned to lives they had left behind, but they were not the same, and neither were their homes. Some were greeted with parades, others with silence. Some carried medals, others invisible wounds. They tried to work, to love, to sleep. Some found comfort in family. Others struggled with memories that would not fade, and yet they did what they had always done. They kept going. The battle might have ended, but for many, the war stayed inside. Stories that must be told. For a long time, people didn't talk about what they had seen. It was too heavy. Too soon. Too much. But slowly, voices emerged. A woman in Paris wrote about hiding in a cellar. A teenager's diary, found in an attic, became a symbol of innocence lost. Anne Frank. Veterans spoke in classrooms. Survivors shared their memories, not for sympathy, but for truth. Films were made, books written, museums built. Each story carried pain, but also power, because memory, once spoken, becomes a shield for the future. A generation is shaped. Those who were children during the war grew up fast. They had seen bombed-out streets before they saw playgrounds, heard sirens before lullabies, learned the word ration before vacation. They became the teachers, builders, thinkers, and artists of a new world. They carried the lessons of the past, even when they didn't speak of them. Many vowed that their children would never go through what they did. And so they built not just cities, but ideas. Ideas about peace, about fairness, about protecting what they once had to live without. An entire generation grew not from comfort, but from courage. Days of remembrance. Across the world, nations chose to remember. Remembrance Day, Memorial Day, Holocaust Remembrance Day, moments of silence, wreaths at monuments, names read aloud, one by one. In schools, children are taught not just about battles, but about people, families, dreams interrupted. These days are not about celebration, they are about reflection, about honoring not just the dead, but the decisions that protect the living, to pause, to listen, to promise, so that the past is never forgotten and never repeated. The cost that can't be counted. World War II claimed over 70 million lives. Soldiers, civilians, children, entire families. But the true cost, it goes beyond numbers. It's in the lullabies never sung, the homes never rebuilt, the inventions never made, the art never painted. It's in the silence left behind by each person who didn't return, and the generations that followed, shaped by the space where someone should have been. This cost cannot be repaid, but it can be remembered, and in remembering, we carry them forward, because a name spoken is a life extended. A quiet promise. At the end of it all, after the treaties, the trials, the rebuilding, there was a simple promise made by millions around the world. Never again. Not in fire, not in fear, not in silence. A promise whispered in ruins, etched into memorials, passed down through stories and songs. It doesn't mean the world has been perfect since, but it means that we still believe in better, that we still choose peace, even when it's hard, that we remember not just the war, but the people who refused to let it define them. And when we tell their stories, softly, carefully, as you've heard them now, we become part of that promise too, because remembrance is not the end of the story, it is how we begin again.